Which is it?
I'm Zeb Elef, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College. And today I'm joined by Professor Jonathan Krasner, the Jack Joseph and Morton Mendel Associate Professor of Jewish Education Research at Brandeis University, a senior colleague, a dear friend, and a mentor. Somebody who he's at home in the fields of American Jewish history and in the field of Jewish education, and has really been at the forefront and almost created a field, in a sense, of the history of Jewish education. You'll deny it, but the rest of us think it's so. And so thanks for joining.
It's my pleasure to be here, Zev. And it's always a delight to speak with you. And I look forward to our conversation.
Great. So as we embark on thinking and talking about the early 20th century, in a sense, that's where the discussion of different forms of Jewish education start to situate itself at the forefront of communal discourse of American Jews. And whereas the 19th century, the synagogue, the shul, was at the center of Jewish life, whether it was Orthodox, Reform, or something in the middle, all of a sudden there's a noticeable shift. But I think we take it for granted that education is this space where where Jewish identity, they didn't call it that certainly, was cultivated, where they became Americanized, as opposed to, say, the public school, or in conjunction with public school.
I think that's absolutely right, Zev. I think that part of the story of Jewish education at the turn of the 20th century is obviously about the importation of particular institutions or types of institutions and their transplantation to American soil, and then their transformation once they are reestablished here. So we talk about the cheder. That's the sort of prototypical one-room schoolhouse with the Melamed, with the teacher. And that is a form that was well known in Europe. And in fact, there are a number of memorable memoirs where people talk about their experiences, not always pleasant experiences, I might add, in those cheders. Those were privately run institutions, and that was where you would send boys, and it was boys, to study. And the ones who showed aptitude were prepared for yeshiva. And this is part of the story that's often forgotten. A lot of folks that were not particularly, suited for academic study, after a certain amount of time would end up being trained for a profession. So that was one institution. And then the other institution was the Talmud Torah. And the Talmud Torah was really the poor man's school in Eastern Europe. It was the charity school. It was the school where the community which took upon itself the responsibility to make sure that all kid boys had an education, would set up a school and would fund the school. And if you couldn't afford to send your kid to a cheder, you would send your kid to the Talmud Torah. So these two institutions are transplanted to American soil. And we can talk a little bit about how they change once they are established here. But to give you a sense of what it would have been like at the beginning of the 20th century, if you want a jaundiced view, you could take a look at the report that Kaplan wrote in 1909 or 1908, I believe. Mordechai Kaplan was sent out to basically do a survey of Jewish education in New York, which was at that time, and I believe still the largest Jewish community in the United States. And he talks about a variety of different institutions, but it was really the Wild West. There was really no regulation at all. There was no certification of teachers. There was no licensure that took place. Basically, anybody who wanted to could put a shingle out and become a Melamed and open up a cheder. And unfortunately, you often had a case where people who weren't necessarily, shall we say, successful in other pursuits would end up opening up a cheder.
You can't do teach, right? Something like that.
Exactly, right. Those who can't do teach. And those who can't teach teachers, right? So although Mordechai Kaplan would definitely demur, but basically part of the business of the first kehillah that was established, or the only kehillah that was established in New York, was to bring some order to this Wild West system of Jewish education. And the way in which the kehillah went about doing that was it ended up using funds that were donated by the Schiff family. Jacob Schiff was a financier. We could go into his history, but he was responsible. He was very, very philanthropic and responsible really single-handedly in some cases for propping up many of the institutions of New York Jewish life. And he donates a pot of money, and the kehillah has to decide how are they going to allocate this money for Jewish education. And rather than divide it up among all of the different schools and all of the different cheders that exist in New York, really sort of building on the report that Kaplan writes, they decide we're going to use this money as a lever to try and raise up the quality of Jewish education. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to choose the largest schools. We're going to fund those schools, but in return for funding those schools, we are going to try and co-opt the folks that are running these schools and try to standardize the curriculum, try to professionalize the teaching force, etc. Now, as it turned out, it was much easier to affect change in Talmud Torahs, in these communal institutions, than it was to try to change these private cheders. And that's why the Talmud Torahs end up becoming sort of the standard bearers of Jewish education in not only New York, but in Boston, in Baltimore, in Cleveland, in a number of communities that had large Jewish immigrant populations. It is not a coincidence that the standardization of Jewish education takes place at around the same time that the federation system gets off the ground. And there's definitely a connection there. Federations tended to shy away from education and cultural funding, reform, and more, let's say, secular Jews who often were the backbone of these federations were reluctant to give money to religious institutions. But there was an understanding that if parents couldn't afford an education, that it was the community's responsibility, if a parent wanted to send their kid to a Jewish school. And so there was some funding that was set aside. There was no uniformity in some communities. Basically, the formula was based on the number of indigent kids that you had in your school. That would indicate how much money an institution would get. In other communities, basically there was a pot of money that they just divvied up to schools that they deemed to be in alignment with the values and the general outlook that the federations had. And that's really, I think, why the Talmud Torahs, these communal institutions, end up winning out over the Cheders. And it really isn't until the Jews move to the suburbs or move out of the city cores that you have a kind of a return to the synagogue as the center of supplementary Jewish education. When I say return, I don't mean return for these immigrants, but I mean, you talked about in your introduction about how in the 19th century, and this certainly remained the case with more established Jewish communities, the supplementary education was an aspect of synagogue life. And at least when Jews were living in these ethnic enclaves, synagogues might have had educational arms, but more often than not, immigrants would send their kids to either a Talmud Torah or a Cheder. These were the institutions that they knew from the past. These were the institutions they were comfortable with. And there were also a lot of immigrants that weren't necessarily affiliated with synagogues that still wanted to send their kids to school. And because of the proximity to other Jews, it wasn't necessary to have a synagogue be the locus of Jewish life in the same way as you would have once people moved out of the city cores.
And what was with so many stakeholders invested in the Talmud Torahs, eventually these programs are no longer just transplants from Europe, but they have to take on certain American forms.
Right, that's absolutely correct. And it's a really, really interesting story in part because it speaks to the acculturation of the community as a whole. Because whereas when we were just talking a second ago, I mentioned that these immigrants tended to gravitate to schools that reminded them of the schools that they had in Europe. Over time, expectations of what education looks like begin to change. And the public school becomes the paragon of, the forward-thinking educational institution. And if you want to give your kid a good education, you send them to a public school. And we could get into the whole issue of the role that public schools play in American Jewish life. Maybe that takes us a little far afield. But for our purposes, once parents sort of buy into the public school, they're also buying into what historians of education call the grammar of schooling. And that's basically everything from graded curriculum to the idea that a teacher should be trained and certified, a set curriculum, children sitting in rows, schools that are not repurposed, vestry rooms or the backs of saloons, or places where sometimes you had these one-room Cheders that were operating. Parents came to expect that school even afternoon school would look like public school. So I think that was the first sort of step towards acculturation. And then you then have this idea of, well, what is a teacher supposed to look like? This is the same period of time when, actually it's a little bit earlier than this, where you have the feminization of elementary education in the public school world. And many Jewish educators come to internalize this idea that a teacher for young children should be maternal. And suddenly the Talmud Torah, which had always had a male teacher at its head, now suddenly you see more and more women entering the workforce and teaching in these schools. And in fact, I mentioned Mordechai Kaplan before, but Kaplan opens up the Teachers Institute at the Jewish Theological Seminary in the 1910s. And very, very quickly, much to his chagrin initially, the student body ends up being predominantly female. And I, although I haven't looked at the exact numbers, my guess is that if you look at Gratz and some of these other schools, you'll also see a shift towards females, predominating in terms of the makeup of these classes. So that's another step, I think, in terms of Americanization. Then the next step, or these are obviously happening simultaneously, you want a teacher that doesn't necessarily have a strong accent. You want a teacher who is worldly, a teacher who can teach in English, et cetera, et cetera. So you have the Americanization of the school. I've written, as you well know, that this Americanization also was manifested in the kind of teaching tools that were used, textbooks in particular. The Reform movement plays a large role in pioneering what we would think of today as modern-looking textbooks. That's not surprising, given the fact that the Reform Jewish population tended to be more acculturated. But more and more, you have Talmud Torahs who are also expecting that, or Talmud Torah parents who are also expecting that their kids will have school books that look like the school books that their kids have from their public schools. And so the textbook publishing business, which in and of itself is an interesting phenomenon, really takes off also at around the same time.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.